Hello and welcome to this very special episode of the White House 1600 Sessions. I'm Stuart McLaurin, President of the White House Historical Association. Today we're at the Embassy of Ireland in Washington, D.C. to talk with our very good friend, Ambassador Geraldine Byrne-Nason, the Ambassador of Ireland to the United States. Well, the history between our two countries goes back as far as our founding. In fact, America might not exist as it does today had it not been for the support of the Irish Parliament and the thousands of colonists with Irish ancestry who sided with the American patriots against the British. So many Irish filled the ranks of General Washington's Continental Army that on March 17, 1780, in the middle of a brutal winter, with resources virtually depleted, General Washington sought to boost the morale of his troops by giving them a day off to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. Well, this was not the first celebration of the Irish holiday. New York City held its first St. Patrick's Day parade 14 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And it's estimated that half of all the U.S. presidents, from Andrew Jackson to Joe Biden, can trace their roots to Ireland. So it's no surprise that the White House continues to mark the month of March with a number of traditions. Of course, there's the annual Shamrock Ceremony, which started in 1952 when Irish Ambassador John Hearne sent President Harry Truman a small box of shamrocks. And to this day, Ireland's leader typically has a standing invitation to visit the White House. In 2009, the Obamas brought a bit of Chicago to Washington and started dyeing the water around the White House and the fountains green, and that continues to this day. 9 presidents have actually traveled to Ireland, with John F. Kennedy being the first. The most recent was President Biden in April of 2023. Like these two presidents, millions of Americans claim their Irish ancestry. It's safe to say that Irish immigrants and their descendants helped build this country. After all, it was an Irish designer, James Hoban, who built the White House. So I'm very pleased to welcome Ambassador Byrne-Nason, my good friend and a great friend of the White House Historical Association, to this podcast. She was previously the ambassador and permanent representative of Ireland to the United Nations and has an impressive career of public service in diplomatic capacities all around the world. We're so grateful for her friendship, and we thank you so much, Ambassador. It's wonderful to be with you here today in the Irish Embassy right on Massachusetts Avenue in Washington. And although you've been ambassador for a few years now, you're not a stranger to the United States in longer terms. Tell us about how, in your view, in your experience, in your observation, the relationship of Ireland and the United States and how you see it evolving.
Well, it's great to welcome you here, Stuart. You are part of the family, so always feel at home here. You know, I was lucky enough to spend 5 years in New York. I sometimes say when I came to Washington, I moved planet because, of course, my focus in my previous role was very much on Syria, Yemen, Iran, and other issues. Now here in Washington, it's a wonderful opportunity for me to focus in a very direct way on probably Ireland's most important relationship, that between the United States and Ireland. I'm also in a position to focus on it, not just in Washington as I find it, friends of Ireland here from the White House to Capitol Hill in the business and economic worlds, but also across the 50 states, because I always say I have 8 parishes, I have 8 consulates busy right across the US. So I see in the 18 months I've been here a real strengthening of that relationship. And of course, a big highlight since I arrived has been the visit of President Biden to Ireland last April. We might talk about that later, but in a way, a reflection for me of the enormity of the task I have here, the extraordinary privilege it is to represent a country where 32 million Americans associate themselves as Irish. So I'm a very lucky ambassador.
Wow. Well, there's one day a year that I think 350 million Americans associate themselves as Irish, which is a wonderful thing. Let's talk about the White House itself. You've been to the White House. Do you remember your first visit there and what your impressions were?
Yes, although I'm a very seasoned diplomat, my first visit was actually when I was appointed here as ambassador to the United States. And I have to say, of course, for an Irish person, seeing the White House from the outside has a particular resonance. We know, and we'll speak with you, the great authority, the Irish architect James Hoban, designed the White House. And there is a sense of, I've seen this place before, iconic as it is. There's a little romantic reflection that this is something to do with Ireland. Leinster House in Dublin, of course, is what I'm referring to there, where he was inspired in his work for the White House. When I went inside, I'll admit, I'm a great fan of West Wing and House of Cards. So like everyone else, I was watching for President Bartlett or President Underwood to pop out and to try and see, could I identify the corridors? And of course I can't.
No.
That was the screen version of the White House. When I actually walked in, it was on the day we were marking credentials. My credentials were done virtually due to COVID. I was brought into the Oval Office to meet President Biden, and that's a heart-stopping moment, to be in a room that's, first of all, so beautiful, and with the weight of history before the door opens, you're so aware, and then the intimacy of the room, you know, leaving aside that you're meeting the President of the United States, you're in the Oval Office, this amazing room that's internationally recognizable. And then I suppose the other thing I take away from my thinking about the White House is a little bit of trivia, which is that I was lucky to be invited one afternoon, since I've arrived here, to play bowling in the bowling alley.
Oh, yes, that's right.
And so that was another side of the White House that I'd never imagined seeing. And that was courtesy of a wonderful colleague working on President Biden's team. And I had a really fun afternoon there. So I've seen many sides of the White House.
That's wonderful. Well, I had the reverse experience to yours when I approached Leinster House in Dublin, and the familiarity of it, that you could see this is clearly the building that inspired Irish-born White House designer James Hoban to present that design to George Washington. And you mentioned the Oval Office, and even though that's a construct of the 20th century, there are 3 oval rooms in the residence itself, what's now the diplomatic reception room, the blue room, and the yellow oval room that Hoban would have designed. And when I saw the Newcomen Bank in Dublin, and I walked in and saw those oval spaces, I thought, this is clearly what inspired Hoban to use that oval shape that is now conveyed over into the Oval Office. So that's really another little Irish nod, if you will, to that. Well, I noticed when I came into your wonderful embassy today, there's a beautiful statue of President Lincoln in your lobby. Tell us about that.
Well, that was a gift to one of my early predecessors here at the embassy. And we have him at the entrance to the embassy as a way of connecting us to your own origins, to the early days of the United States. You know, we had, during your Civil War, we had some famous Irishmen like Thomas Francis Maher, who came and worked on the Union side, who were contributors to your own peaceful evolution. I always think that President Lincoln, whether he's inside the door of the embassy or in his amazing monument, is a great touchstone for us here in Washington. A bit of a reflection on the big journey many Irish immigrants had when they came to the US, but with that sense of possibility, ambition, and hope that this great United States still instills in all of us.
Well, we're so honored to have your son Alex on our Next Gen Leaders program. This is a program of next generation young people that are in all sectors, and he represents an international dimension with his Irish connection and heritage, which we're very proud to have. And I know you and I share a passion and a deep interest in engaging the next generations of Irish and Americans and broadening our understanding of one another. Why is that important to you?
Well, you know, I think the important thing, you were very kind to reference Alex, so I sometimes see that next generation through the eyes of a mother and a son who has found his passion in your great country here and is thrilled and very proud to be a next-gen leader of the White House Historical Association. He believes in the United States. He believes passionately in the responsibility of his own generation to reinforce your institutions, to work with young people like him, to address the big challenges that are coming down the track. I think sometimes generationally we seem to think that the possibilities are endless. And I think in Alex's generation, the 20-something generation now, they're seeing the limits of so many things. They're seeing the limits in terms of our environment, perhaps seeing more disruptive conflict internationally than the generation before them had seen. And also, I think they're worrying about the limits of democracy, sometimes challenges to democracy. So having an opportunity to work with like-minded young people to reinforce the commitment to the public spirit and to the common good, that's what I know inspires him. And I'm so grateful that God gave him that sense of purpose, because he's thrilled to be able to express that, working through those next-gen leaders.
Well, he has a wonderful intellect and wit and energy, and I hope we can build that cohort of young Irish leaders and young American leaders focusing on this history that we share, even through James Hoban and in other ways.
Absolutely. You know, we miss a little bit now these days that pipeline we used to have, a regular refreshing of the 32 million Irish Americans. These days, it's not so easy for young people to arrive and spend some time here in the United States. I hope that we can overcome some of those obstacles. Young Irish people coming into the United States have always brought inspiration and passion. Many of them in the 20th century returned to Ireland, so we see that cross-fertilization happening. So I hope, as you say, we can grow that through this generation of Irish.
And I think the reverse is true. Even for me, going to Ireland and seeing County Kilkenny and the places in Dublin that inspired James Hoban. Last summer, on the 60th anniversary of President Kennedy's famous trip there as president, as of course Kennedy's our only president to be of pure Irish descent. All of his great-grandparents were Irish. And to see the pride of the people there, that President Kennedy had come from their community and their memories. People were there that remembered his visit 60 years ago. And to me, I understood more and better and more deeply when I could meet those people and see those places that our presidents came from. And we are a nation of immigrants, and our presidents are descended from peoples around the world. And I think that's so important for our young people to understand. And it helped me when I was privileged to visit Ireland as well.
Well, you know, you mentioned President Kennedy, and I always think he's emblematic of the phrase that the tapestry of the United States is woven through with the green of the Emerald Isle. And President Kennedy was really this moment of extraordinary awakening, his election here in the United States. You know, Ireland had tough times after our initial period of independence, tough times economically. Our people continued to leave the island. Suddenly, as we saw it as Irish people, one of our own was in the big White House. We had come of age internationally. I often think it was a little vignette of a golden moment. Ireland joined the United Nations, so we found our platform on the international level in 1956. Then we had President Kennedy in the Oval Office, and also, sometimes forgotten, but I always mention her, Grace Kelly, who left Philadelphia to become a princess. So Irish people began to think, wow, we can actually look in a confident way off the island. And President Kennedy's deep attachment to the country, as you said, he was pure Irish. Jackie Kennedy said he had spoken about his time in Ireland as the happiest days of his life, and we like to hold on to that reflection that he found himself. I saw that hugely last April in the warmth in both ways. President Biden coming back to be received in an extraordinary way.
Yes.
And I have to say, the beginning of my own career, and I always keep him somewhere near me in this office, I began my career as President Reagan came to Ireland. So we have had so many 23 of the 46 presidents who have
right.
claimed Irish heritage. But those two, both President Reagan beginning my career and now as I arrived here in the United States, President Biden visiting, with that moment of extraordinary importance, of course, that President Clinton and other very important actors like Tip O'Neill brought to Ireland. We're a very lucky people that not just the imagination, but the commitment and the spirit of Ireland has survived the Atlantic journey and has been passed through generationally and in a bipartisan way here in the United States.
Well, Ambassador, you're from County Louth in Ireland, as is President Biden. Have you had an opportunity to talk to him about being from the same area and maybe perhaps even being cousins?
Well, I wish I could prove that we were cousins, but yes, I was so proud. I believe it's destiny in a way when I was appointed and I realised that, you know, County Louth is the smallest county in Ireland, quite frequently overlooked. So in the Foreign Ministry, the joke is always, I'm the ambassador of County Louth. So when President Biden visited Ireland, it was this wonderful moment for me. Local girl does good, makes good, coming home with the President of the United States to her home county. And that was really a blissful moment to see him reflect, standing in Carlingford, County Louth, on the journey his family had taken generations before and the hardship they'd faced leaving the island. But, you know, he actually brought it up with me before I brought it up with him, because on the day I mentioned earlier, when I went to the White House to formally be received by the President, I was announced as the Ambassador of Ireland. And as soon as I entered the Oval Office, he turned and he said, no, she's the Ambassador of County Louth. So I will always remember that moment. Huge moment for me personally,
Yes.
of course, but also a lovely reflection that the President carried the Finnegans of County Louth with him. And a little unknown trivia fact, another one, is that one of his grandmother, I think, or his great-grandmother was Geraldine, which is an unusual enough name.
Yes.
So again, as I say, fate and destiny interwoven with good decisions by the Irish government to appoint a Geraldine here in the United States.
That's wonderful. That's a wonderful connection about the name. Well, James Hoban, who we've mentioned, of course, is primary to White House history, having designed and built the building that is so reminiscent of Irish country houses that he would have been exposed to, as well as Leinster House. I was struck when I went to County Kilkenny that they seemed to know of James Hoban, but not so much about James Hoban. What is the awareness there of him? And maybe is there a way that we could use that as a means of, maybe with our education programs, with starting with some schools in County Kilkenny, through our resources, help educate young Irish about this fundamental place they have in American history?
Well, you know, absolutely hope we can do more, because Hoban is a bit of an unsung hero. I have to be very careful what I say with you as the world's leading authority on James Hoban. But for Irish people, I think they're aware an Irish architect had a role. But the idea that he carried in his imagination and his eye Leinster House from Ireland, and as you say, interiors of Irish Georgian homes, and brought them here to the United States as a young man, emblematic of a lot of Irish leaving the island, not much money in his pocket, leaving his hometown in search of fortune here, and to be found almost by chance by George Washington. He was working in Charleston, if I'm not wrong.
That's right.
So I'm always regretting that Irish people don't immediately come and say, where is the James Hogan Memorial here in Washington? When they ask me, I say it's the White House. But of course, his grave, which we know well, you have honoured very well every year, is in Washington. I would love to make it a more living memory if we can, and particularly to your point about education, because I think Hoban himself, you know, had to make big choices to leave behind his family and his education in Ireland. That's not a choice a lot of young Irish people have to make anymore. So having an opportunity to show the extraordinary achievements and to better announce him in a way as part of our exceptional Irish-United States relationship would be wonderful. So I think we could easily work together with you on something very special that would make sure that James Hoban finds his place in our bigger conversation.
Well, I see that my mind is turning here with ideas, so I look forward to working with you on that. Well, James Hoban was Catholic, of course, and at that time in the late 18th century, there were still the laws in Ireland that prevented Catholics from rising to the top of their profession. And so I know he would not have used this vocabulary, but he was really an early pursuer of an American dream to leave Ireland, go first to Philadelphia and then to Charleston, where he had that providential encounter with George Washington. But a man who spent from 1792 to 1800 building the White House. Then he rebuilt it after those British people burned it. And then he added the South Portico and the North Portico with Presidents Monroe and Jackson, and then died in 1831. So from 1792 to 1831, so much of his life was spent around what we call the White House today. And the world knows that building, those three words, the White House, but so little about James Hoban, the Irishman. And let's work together to use that, his inspiration, particularly with education. I'm excited about that.
Well, I look forward to that because as you describe it, his fingerprints are over not just the imagery, but also the fabric of the house that houses your wonderful democracy. And as you say, that's globally recognizable. And, you know, we have many Irish names and Irish individuals who have cut a dash on the global stage. James Hoban's debut remains. So I hope that we can join hands on that together.
Well, in my opening comments, I spoke to the contributions of the Irish to the American Revolution and victory for our cause at that time. What is it about the Irish spirit and independence?
Well, it is a tiny island out there in the Atlantic. We struggled for 700 years to win our own sovereignty, our own independence. So I think a history like that, which was harsh, you mentioned in your earlier remarks, our famine, where of course, you know, our population was devastated by hunger. Millions had to leave the island thereafter. It was a tough upbringing as a nation. And that spirit of independence was forged out of that hardship, in my view. What we tended to do, and that sense of that independent Irish spirit, was while we weren't achieving our own independence, I always think of Samuel Beckett and we failed better each time, but we didn't quite get there until just over 100 years ago. In the meantime, we had our brightest and our best, our diplomats of the era, our top military, who were either expelled or chose to leave Ireland and to adopt other independent causes. The United States, primary amongst them, you know, we have big names like Commodore Barry and Henry Knox, who was your first Secretary of War, well known. But I believe there were over 300,000 Irish foot soldiers in the American Revolution. So Irish people, as it were, voted with their feet and worked for independence for the United States. On this continent, there are 11 modern Latin American democracies who have Irish liberators in their history. Yeah. So we sort of exported our independent spirit before we were able to repatriate it with the help of the United States, I must say, to ensure that Ireland could take her own place among the nations of the earth. And that's an independent, feisty spirit that we continue to, I would say, use as part of our broader, rather independent, principled position we take internationally.
I loved your reference and the visual of the Irish green woven into the tapestry of America. In your estimation, what have been the most significant contributions that Irish or Irish Americans have made over the course of our history here in America?
Well, you know, of course, I will say at the top, you know, seeing somebody sit in the White House with an Irish heritage, of course, and we've touched on that, is exceptional. But, you know, we've had Irish immigration predominantly starting after our famine and right through the 19th into the 20th century. Those immigrants who came, very often, they came in difficult circumstance, but many of them very quickly, within a generation, made up the fabric of your first responders. Everyone knows about the Irish cops in New York, O'Shea, Murphy, O'Brien on the streets of New York, the nurses, the labour union organisers. I like to mention Mother Jones, a Cork woman who worked for child labour rights in the 19th century, who worked for miners' rights. Kate Kennedy, an Irish woman, labour organiser in California, who won the case for equal pay for equal work for teachers in the state of California. So we had women and men who were working in that way, building, I think, the fabric of this great country through the 19th into the 20th century. Today, that achievement, your question, what do I think we're achieving? Today, I'm as likely to meet an Irish woman in the Silicon Valley board of a high-tech company, or to encounter someone in LA in the screen industry, to have Irish fintech investors who come in here into the United States. You know, there are over 100,000 jobs here directly financed by Irish investors here in the United States. Ireland, remarkably for our size, 5 million people, we are your 9th source of foreign direct investment inward here. You're a wonderful partner with your investment in Ireland. That's usually recognised. But the fact that Irish investors are coming in here in a very 21st century way, I can't not speak when I think of the achievements of Irish America, if I use that term very loosely, that the Irish diaspora here played a huge role in helping the US government in administrations, bipartisan, from Republican to Democrats, I mentioned, from Reagan to Biden, keeping faith with Ireland's political challenges on the island, and particularly the troubles in Northern Ireland. We celebrated 25 years last year of the Good Friday Agreement. Is there a crowning glory for Irish America? It's that we are a peaceful, successful island thanks to the support, I usually say, peace in Ireland made in America. So a great achievement. But Irish immigrants built that up through this interweaving that you've aptly described in the tapestry of the great USA.
For Americans who don't understand Ireland and Northern Ireland and the independent Ireland that you represent, how would you explain that to them in a way that they would understand?
For people who haven't followed step by step our evolution on the island, I think a lot of people will recognize that we had a period of over 30 years of trouble on the island of Ireland. When we had terrorist activity on the island, we had people dying. I grew up in a border county, the County Louth you referenced earlier. Young children, refugees left Northern Ireland in the late 60s, early 70s for safety in my hometown, in my school. Thankfully, through the efforts of several Irish and British governments working deliberately with both parties, with all parties in Northern Ireland, to establish a peaceful settlement, the Good Friday Agreement, famously the midwife being Senator George Mitchell, for whom we have deep respect and reverence. President Clinton's appointment of George Mitchell, a really important moment 25 years ago. Now we have an important set of relationships between Northern Ireland and between Belfast and Dublin. We also have a very important relationship between Dublin and London. While we're not saying there will never be challenges going forward, we now see those three relationships primed again and ready to go. We invest hugely in what we regard as the shared island. There is no hard border on the island of Ireland. Sometimes visitors, I'm sure you've seen this, Stuart, visitors to Ireland say to me, I didn't see the border. And I say, isn't that a wonderful thing?
Yes.
We have two administrations on the island, but certainly we have a united sense of this is a shared space. The Irish government is investing in infrastructure, in universities, in education establishments, in health sectors in Northern Ireland. What's in Northern Ireland's interests is in the interests of Ireland as a whole. And that's something I work every day here to reinforce.
Well, thank you for explaining that, because I do think Americans everyday Americans struggle to understand the difference in the relationships, and that positivity that you have shared and the optimism for that is really important.
We're at a really good moment now with huge potential, and I think it's important that we all take this moment as a serious one. You spoke earlier about the next generation of young people, and the generation in Northern Ireland today, they are under 25. They have never known other than peace in Northern Ireland. What a wonderful thing. I regard it as a political, moral, every other way responsibility, including an economic responsibility that's shared to make sure the future of that generation is the best it can be. And President Biden's appointment of Joe Kennedy, young Joe, as they call him, Joe Kennedy III, has been inspirational, and he is working with great support from US investors to reinforce the economic side of what has been, as I say, a bit of a bumpy road in Northern Ireland for a while.
You mentioned the importance of the British-Irish relationship, and clearly we as Americans have, we fought our independence against Britain, but now one of our closest allies, Irish, supported us in that cause. Now we all three work in harmony. During this month of March, which is Women's History Month here in the United States, how wonderful is it that two of the most brilliant, accomplished, dynamic ambassadors here are women and representing Ireland and Britain. And we happen to have a woman ambassador in Dublin and a woman ambassador in London.
This is, again, the stars align at times. I'm a great advocate for women being in the room and at the table. And Karen Pierce, whom you referenced very generously there as my colleague here in Washington, she and I sat also in New York at the Security Council table when Ireland was a member of the Security Council. So we've been colleagues over time. We know each other, work very well. That makes a difference. Claire Cronin in Dublin is an outstanding representative, Bostonian Irish. It doesn't get much better than that. So certainly, we love the idea that we have that female strong spirit that represents Irish UK relations. And Jane Hartley, who is your ambassador in London, I know has Irish background, also a Bostonian background in one way. Jane and I were ambassadors together in Paris in the past. I would also underline that in Northern Ireland, where I mentioned that moment of possibility now, we have two women leading the Northern Ireland executive. So we have the First Minister, Michelle O'Neill, and the Deputy First Minister, Emma Little-Pengelly. So we have a cohort of well-spirited, good-meaning women. So I think that's a certain hopeful note that you've highlighted there.
Well, here we are in this historic building, which I believe has been owned by the Irish government since 1949, representing the Irish diplomatic tip of the spear here in our country. Tell us about the evolution of diplomatic relationships between our two countries, particularly in the modern era.
We are in this iconic building, which a lot of Irish people, they come to Washington, they drive by to see the tricolour hanging outside the window. So I'm honoured to be here. Our relationship diplomatically is exactly 100 years old this year. June 100 years ago, the first Irish ambassador established himself. It wasn't a wonderful woman at the time. It was as I like to say, a non-woman. So it was a man who was here representing Ireland, established a really strong relationship, of course, with the United States that has evolved in a very dynamic way. I mentioned our big Irish diaspora. So the anchor for our relationship with the United States is a people-to-people relationship. So the Irish people coming into the United States, establishing themselves here economically as our diaspora is at the heart of everything about that relationship over 100 years. We have a huge emigrant support program, so over 200 million euros over the last 20 years we bring to supporting our Irish immigrants here in the United States. That's unique as an instrument. People often say to me, how does Irish America remain so identified with Ireland? And we work we invest in our community here. So I think everything about the Irish-American relationship must begin and end in a way with our people. But two important big markers there are also our economic relationship, which I touched on. So once Ireland became a member of the European Union, our economic potential was unleashed. But of course, I've mentioned the challenges we had in those 100 years on the island. From our independence, we lived through a civil war. We then had trouble on the island. So the hand of friendship that the United States has shown to us politically, through good times and bad, and particularly through the Troubles, when the United States, and I emphasize again, across administrations, President Carter mentioned a role for the United States. President Reagan grasped that as an Irish American. It grew and blossomed with President Clinton, coming through to President Obama's arrival, the O''Bama, as he's known in Ireland, who also supported us, and then quintessentially with another Irishman in the White House in President Biden. So we have a very, I would say, technicolor relationship. There are many shades and many layers that we've built up over 100 years. But I can say without fear of being contradicted, this relationship goes from strength to strength. And I regard it as my sacred responsibility here to ensure that I move it on a little bit during my tenure.
Wow. That's really inspiring. I appreciate you sharing that. And I'd like to delve further into our presidents who have visited Ireland. We spoke about Kennedy being the first, and then we referenced Reagan and Clinton and others who have visited, certainly President Biden most recently. When I was there last summer, I stood in the Irish Parliament where several of these have spoken, and you could feel, at least in my spirit, I could feel the reverberation of their words and the excitement of them being there, and there's physical markers reminding of their visits there. Talk about your views on their visits and why it's important for not just American presidents of Irish descent, but for American presidents to visit Ireland and what that means to the Irish people and really what that means to our relationship.
Well, you know, you're right that when you visit Ireland, you will find markers in our parliament, of course, but right across the country, tiny towns that were unheard of until an American president visited. I mentioned Ballyporeen, which is where President Reagan visited, and I've earlier mentioned Carlingford, which we heard that President Biden, tiny towns which assume a new symbolic relevance in our relationship. Why is it so important for Irish people to see a US president? I think part of it is that sense of a validation of the confidence that we feel in this 21st century now as Irish people on the global stage, that an existential relationship that has seen us through our independence into our modern confident states status today, that has still, what President Biden used a phrase that I always use on this, which is that we have a nostalgia for the future. So we carry with us the historic import of everything we have done together, whether it was that American Revolution. You know, there is this book about how the Irish won the American Revolution. Maybe exaggerated, but Irish people have a sense that we played a role. But then we are at this very important moment looking ahead together, and to see the leader of the free world come, particularly, I will say, in a time when there are either challenges as we had on the island. For example, when President Clinton came visiting Northern Ireland, the first time a president did that, at a quintessentially sensitive moment in a political process. Or now, when internationally we have, you know, dislocation, we have the war in Ukraine, we have difficulties in the Middle East, seeing a president who plays a leading role in shaping global peace and shaping the history going forward, to see that we can have a conversation at that level. It's critical for Irish people to know that that relationship remains as vibrant and as respected as it was over 100 years ago when we established this relationship.
You mentioned Ballyporeen, and where President Reagan ancestrally is from,
Yes.
and he visited there with Mrs. Reagan, and there's a wonderful picture of them at a pub in Ballyporeen.
I was in the pub with them.
And
Yeah.
subsequently,
Yes.
the former chairman of our board, Fred Ryan,
Yes.
of Irish
Yes.
descent, who chairs the Reagan Foundation
Yes.
board, purchased that pub when it was closed, transported it to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California, where today you can go and have a pint in the pub directly from Ballyporeen. And what a wonderful thing that is, to share a bit of culture and a bit of personal connect with people who visit this wonderful presidential library.
You know, I had just become a young diplomat at the time, and I was lucky enough to be included in the visit. And I was actually inside the pub
how
on the
great.
day with the president and Mrs. Reagan. And I can remember the anxiety of the Secret Service around that pint. So the president was very relaxed about it. Everyone around him was quite excited. Fred Ryan, whom I've come to know, has invited me to come and pull a pint
You
in
should.
California.
You should. Yes.
So that's on my list of pleasurable tasks that I
Yes.
look forward to. But it's a symbolic and poetic way of saying that what President Reagan did during that visit, he brought that tiny village alive. He touched the soil of his ancestors. I remember they had a small pot of soil for him. He touched his Irishness in a way that marked me forever as a young diplomat starting out her career. I think in those few moments, I got the measure of what the relationship could mean to someone who had come, you know, from Hollywood
Yes.
to the White House and arrived in this tiny Irish village, but saw his Irishness shine through.
And clearly, the ancestors of these presidents, when they left Ireland to come to America under difficult circumstances, never dreamed that someone downline in their family would come back and seek out their family roots, much less be president of the United States.
Well, you're so right. You know, there was this wonderful moment uncovered, I think, as a part of the planning for President Biden's visit that saw the most remarkable discovery, which was that President Biden and President Obama's great-great-grandfathers both left from the same area, the same ports. They both left within 6 weeks of each other, and they were both shoemakers. Now, what are the chances of history and stars aligning in that way? Those two men leaving absolutely not by choice. No one leaves their homeland, and certainly a beautiful country like Ireland, no one left by choice. They left out of necessity. Their dreams were probably no greater than that they might be able to provide for their families, and maybe, just maybe if they were lucky enough, have their children get an education, that they would grow presidents of the great United States, as you say, was never a part of in their wildest imagination. And that's part of the wonder and the romance of this relationship, that we have seen the American dream realized by so many Irish Americans. And it's something for which Irish people remain deeply grateful over time.
Well, I think the diaspora of every other country in the world is envious of the Irish. One day a year when the great St. Patrick's Day occurs. And it is a time, as I mentioned, that everyone in America is a bit Irish on that day, and the water at the White House is turned green. And there is a custom and a tradition where your prime minister, your Taoiseach, or some other representative will come over and present to the president a bowl of shamrocks. Tell us how that tradition began and symbolically what that means.
It's such a beautiful tradition, and as children in Ireland, we would gather around the TV to watch that moment. I have to give credit to Ambassador Joseph Hearn, who came in 1952 just with a small idea. He brought a small box, nothing glamorous, nothing fancy, a small box of shamrock, which we hold dear to as a symbol of Ireland. He brought it to a meeting with the then President Truman and said, "This is just for you on St. Patrick's Day." That was such an imaginary, creative idea, because within 1 year, following year was President Eisenhower. Suddenly there was a crystal bowl. We're good at making beautiful crystal in Ireland.
Yes.
planted shamrock in the bowl, and then a ceremony grew around that. And over time, it waxed and waned a little bit. But once President Kennedy, of course, arrived with his Irishness, and subsequent presidents like President Kennedy, President Reagan, we've mentioned President Clinton, they saw the value of this. A moment, of course, let's be clear, it's not all about the image. Irish American voters must be very happy to see their president do this. But it's also, I did use the term earlier, I love that term, party with the purpose. I know that those moments when that shamrock bowl is handed across is the tip of the iceberg of a wonderful day where we have a very serious substantive discussion every year with the President of the United States, whoever he is, or she maybe in the future, but where we have that really important substantive discussion. And that was so important to us last year. I was delighted to be part of that in the Oval Office. But I know in past years, particularly when times were bumpy on the island, the Shamrock Bowl moment was also used to facilitate contacts in Northern Ireland and to try and advance the process. Even last year, the Northern Ireland Executive and Assembly were not sitting. We still hadn't come out of that Brexit shadow yet. And there were a lot of important political actors from Northern Ireland here who I know found the conversations they had in Washington, I'd like to say around the bowl or around that wonderful green fountain, that those conversations made a difference. So it's something that we hold dear to, and its symbolism, it's beautiful. My heart beats faster when I see the bowl every year, but there's substance behind it.
And a brilliant move of soft diplomacy to begin that has carried on from president to president and ambassador to ambassador.
Absolutely. You know, in the beginning, the ambassador was the one who presented the bowl. As it acquired a weight, if you like to say, and importance, our Taoiseach, the Prime Ministers, the Taoiseach of the day, saw this as an excellent moment. And I'm thrilled that we look forward to that every year, to having the individual who leads Ireland on the day come out here and stand shoulder to shoulder with the President of the United States, but with something that's as clever and creative as a way of saying, we value this relationship.
There's around St. Patrick's Day week, of course, this is the embassy, but there's a wonderful, not very far from here, hotel, DuPont Circle Hotel, that's owned by the Doyle Collection, an Irish group, which I've stayed at their hotel in Dublin and been their guests here. And that is like the Irish embassy in itself through that whole week, a party and a great focus on the many modes of Irish connectivity with our country, with the White House in great anticipation of presenting that bowl of shamrocks on St. Patrick's Day.
You're so right. The DuPont Hotel is like a home from home. You go in there during that week. You know, at any time of the year, I'm very likely to meet an Irish person in that great hotel. But in St. Patrick's Week, it's literally like being back in Ireland. Everyone there, I don't know what the normal US clients do in that week. Maybe it's they become Irish for those days, but it is a wonderful hub of excitement and the wearing of the green, as we call it. So there's a tremendous atmosphere, you know, in a world where we carry burdens, all of us, whether it's on the island or reflecting on the difficulties in the global context or the big challenges the United States faces here. You have a big election this year. This is time out. It's a little moment where we reflect, and I like to say everyone is either Irish or wants to be Irish on St. Patrick's Day.
That's right. Well, it was St. Patrick's Day week in 2021 when we had just published this book on James Hoban, and I had a special green leather box made for the president and placed the book in that, took it over to him. And I thought he might be interested in it, but to this day, if you go in the Oval Office, there on the coffee table between the two sofas in front of the fireplace is that green book. And I think he uses that to share his Irish heritage and his love today four things Irish.
I can testify to that. I was astounded. Immediately in the Oval Office, of course, you're taken by the president himself, but I'll allow myself to say your eyes drift a little bit in the Oval Office. And James Hoban was there. I came out with a sense of, my goodness, we have two Irishmen in the Oval Office now.
Great.
So it is wonderful to see. And thank you for doing the work that elevated all that James Hoban was, because, as I said, he was a little unsung. To see him now sit on the coffee table in the Oval Office,
Yes.
every day registers his legacy, but also that he's alive in conversation with us
Well,
now.
thank you. I've enjoyed learning. One of the great things about my job is I could work in this role the rest of my career, and hope I do, but I learn something new every single day. And even about Hoban and his impact and influence, not a perfect man by any means, but quite a legacy that he has. And I thank you for us joining together and to read the children's book. We created a children's book on James Hoban, and in your residence, we brought school children and had the opportunity to tell that story. And you could see in their eyes an interest to know more about this and learning about Hoban, but about the Irish-American connection.
I thought that was one of the most lovely moments I have had since I arrived. We spoke about next generation, but to talk about young children who are just beginning to understand the world around them. And for them, I felt the way you provided them with the sense of this is a house. It was built as a home and a house. They were beginning to understand the White House in a different way. And then the curiosity of association. How many of those children put up their hands to say, I'm Irish. I have my father, my mom is Irish. There was almost a competition in the end to be associated with James Hoban and his Irishness and the White House. So I hope that as you and I work on that effort to make James Hoban better understood in Ireland and here, that we also do it from the ground up with the youngest minds who can bring that sense of Irish building together here with the American brothers and sisters going forward. We talk about it rhetorically for young children like that, to see it in a book. And, building a house is what every young child learns to do, sitting on the carpet.
And maybe we could do something like that virtually with a group of students in Ireland,
We
in
could
Kilkenny.
absolutely
would be a
do
great
that.
fun thing to do.
I'd
So
be very
we
happy
have good
to
work that we
join.
can do together.
Absolutely.
Well, I always close with a question that are intrigued about how my guests will respond to this. Reflecting back of the 46 presidents of the United States, 45, Cleveland being twice. If you could sit down, let's add James Hoban to the mix. If you and James Hoban could sit down for dinner tonight with a handful of American presidents, maybe with an Irish interest, maybe not, who would you enjoy visiting with, and what would you want to know from them?
Well, I would have to start by saying the president that I woke up to was President Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, who gave us a sense as Irish people that anything was possible. He talked about going to the moon, and we thought, an Irishman in the White House is our moonshot. So I would love to see him at a table and to ask him in particular, not just to elaborate on his own Irish background, but about his unfulfilled dreams for America, because, he also had such an Irish spirit in terms of the sense of civil rights in your own country, the 20th century America that he dreamt of, and to be cut off so early. I would love to sit with John F. Kennedy. I have to say, personally, because it was the beginning of my career, I have such happy memories of President Reagan coming to Ireland. I was lucky enough to travel with the President and Mrs. Reagan. My mom watched me on TV go up on Air Force One to be thanked by them, the photograph that I have here. So I would also love to ask him, now that he, with all that's gone on in those 40 years since he visited Ireland, what does he think of Ireland now? It's a different Ireland. We very happily are a very diverse, modern, vibrant Ireland. I graduated from university in 1982. A lot of people, even in 1982, didn't find jobs in Ireland. He might not recognize that Ireland. And then I'm going to do something totally out of the box, if I may, and say, I would love to invite Eleanor Roosevelt to the table. I spent a career partly in Brussels and at the UN, as you mentioned. So doing what we call multilateral, working with many countries to build something bigger than all of us. She was such an inspirational woman in particularly the work she did on human rights. And, you know, she inspired a lot of women to take a role in public life. She wasn't an elected president. We know how much she helped her husband in his presidency. But she, subsequent to leaving the White House, did an enormous work that has, again, a bit of an unsung role. I would love to hear her voice amongst the voices of American presidents. She lived in that White House. She lived through what the big challenging decisions were. But to ask her particularly on the work she did on developing the Human Rights Declaration and on thinking on the diversity in your own country, what she would bring to the modern American conversation.
That would be a wonderful dinner conversation with you, Hoban, Kennedy, Reagan, and Eleanor Roosevelt.
And we'd invite you, Stuart.
Oh, thank you very much. I would love to be there. Well, Ambassador, thank you for the extraordinary job you do on behalf of the people of Ireland. As always, I'm inspired visiting with you, and thank you for inviting us into your embassy today. And I look forward to continued productive and exciting work for your country, for our country, and our relationship.
Well, it's a treasured relationship, Stuart. So I regard our conversation this morning as just the beginning, and particularly to growing those next generation links. The White House Historical Association has very important lessons for our younger people to hear, and I hope that we can work very closely together in the next phase of our relationship.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you all for listening and watching today. Be sure to subscribe to the White House 1600 Sessions on your favorite podcast provider so that you never miss an episode. And please watch the video version on YouTube and Facebook. Your support of the White House Historical Association makes this work possible. When you become an association member, or when you purchase a book or an official White House Christmas ornament, you are helping fund the education mission through our teacher programming, our publishing, and our latest initiative, one that I'm extremely excited about, the People's House, a White House experience. In September 2024, we will launch this new immersive experience at 1700 Pennsylvania Avenue. The People's House will be open to everyone. You can learn more about our work as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization by going to our website, whitehousehistory.org. Thank you very much.